let's jump right in. Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're diving straight into a story titled Where Spice Was Paid in Fire, The Dark Tide on the Malabar Coast. We're going to strip away the sanitized, textbook versions of Vasco da Gama's legacy. You know, the ones that paint him purely as this heroic European pioneer. Instead, we're going to critically examine the raw, documented reality of what actually happened on the Indian subcontinent. It's a fascinating, complex story of incredible global trade, but also extreme violence and a colonial legacy that literally still shapes the modern world today. It's wild how history can give us these completely split narratives. On one hand, you have the European perspective, where da Gama is celebrated as a legendary maritime hero, the visionary who charted a treacherous sea route to Asia and kicked off an era of globalized trade. But flip the coin, and from the Indian perspective, a totally different figure emerges. He's remembered as a violent raider, a man who arrived using deceit, utilized immense brutality, and completely shattered centuries of peaceful, open maritime trade. Today, we're looking at the primary sources to see how one person can hold two deeply opposed places in human history.
Here is our roadmap for today. We'll track his impact across three distinct expeditions: 1497, his initial voyage of exploration; 1502, his brutal return for enforcement and terror; and finally 1524, his administrative mission that ultimately ends in his death.
Okay, first things first, we absolutely have to debunk this pervasive myth of discovery. India was never discovered by Europe. Long before Portuguese ships ever appeared on the horizon, the Malabar coast was an incredibly wealthy, globally connected hub. We're talking about a thriving maritime power dating way back to the 1st century BC. It was a cosmopolitan melting pot where Arab, Jewish, and Indian merchants traded entirely freely. They were exporting vast amounts of cotton, silk, ivory, and, of course, highly coveted spices. In fact, ancient Greeks and Romans loved Indian pepper so much that locals called it Yavanapriya, which literally translates to the passion of the Greeks. This was an already sophisticated world of immense wealth.
So why did Europe suddenly need a sea route so badly? It actually all traces back to the year 1453, with the fall of Constantinople to the Ottoman Empire. That massive event sent shockwaves through Europe because it completely severed their direct land access to the east. Suddenly, the ancient Silk Road and spice routes were heavily taxed and tightly blocked by the Ottomans. The markup on spices became just astronomically high. Driven by this pure economic desperation, nations like Portugal and Spain had to look to the uncharted oceans, desperately trying to find a direct path to bypass the blockade and get to India's riches.
Which brings us to our first major chapter, the 1498 arrival and humiliation.
When da Gama finally dropped anchor in Calicut in May 1498, after almost a year at sea, the monumental first contact was honestly a massive, almost comical culture clash. The Zamarin, the powerful local ruler, commanded immense wealth. He was used to receiving lavish tributes of gold, silver, and precious gems from foreign merchants. So what did da Gama present on behalf of the mighty Portuguese crown? 12 striped robes, 6 hats, some coral beads, brass vessels, oil, and honey. To a highly sophisticated ruler whose empire traded in diamonds and fine silks, these gifts were insultingly cheap. It was just completely baffling to them.
The Zamarin's officials literally laughed at da Gama right there in the court, declaring the offerings entirely unfit for a great ruler. As you might imagine, this diplomatic disaster severely bruised da Gama's ego, and he eventually left Calicut pretty furious and humiliated. But here's the crazy part. Even though he failed to get a formal trade treaty, the tiny fraction of spices he did manage to load onto his ships and bring back to Portugal yielded a staggering 60 times profit. That massive windfall proved da Sea route was an absolute goldmine, turning him into a hero at home and unfortunately sealing the violent fate of the Malabar coast.
Moving right into 1502, the brutal return. Fueled by that bruised ego and the promise of infinite wealth, da Gama's second act was a whole lot darker. In 1502, he didn't come back as a humble merchant or a curious explorer. He returned commanding a heavily armed war fleet of 20 ships, totally prepared to use extreme violence to secure Portuguese dominance. He completely bypassed diplomacy and slammed the Zamarin with two immediate non-negotiable demands. First, totally expel all Arab and Muslim merchants from the region, people who had lived and traded there peacefully for generations. And second, abandon centuries of free trade and grant Portugal an exclusive monopolistic trade agreement.
Naturally, the Zamarin wanted to protect his sovereignty and his prosperous free trade policies, so he refused to comply with these aggressive terms. Da Gama didn't even try to negotiate further. Instead, he anchored his heavily armed fleet just off the coast and unleashed the massive firepower of his cannons straight onto the unfortified trading city of Calicut. For 2 full days, he relentlessly bombarded the city, destroying homes and initiating a horrifying campaign of terror designed to simply shock the locals into absolute submission.
The sheer brutality of this enforcement is honestly staggering, and it's entirely drawn from the documented historical record. During this siege, Da Gama's men captured 38 innocent local fishermen who were just out working on their boats. Da Gama ordered his men to severely mutilate them, systematically cutting off their hands, noses, and ears. Then, in an act of pure psychological warfare, he loaded their severed body parts into a small boat and sent it ashore to the Zamarin with a taunting note. The message actually mocked the ruler, telling him to use the bloody remains to make a curry. It was a monstrous, calculated act meant to break the region's spirit.
This brings us to the factual and emotional core of this explainer, the tragedy of the Miri. The atrocities committed by Da Gama's fleet didn't stop at the coastline. In 1502, off the Malabar coast, his forces committed what is arguably the most defining act of cruelty of his expeditions, the horrific interception of a ship known as the Miri. Now, the Miri was not a warship. It was an unarmed vessel carrying over 300 Muslim passengers. While there were some wealthy merchants aboard, the vast majority were vulnerable civilians, women, children, and elderly pilgrims peacefully returning home from the Hajj in Mecca. As Da Gama's warships surrounded them, the passengers made desperate pleas for mercy. The wealthy merchants even offered to fill Da Gama's ships with unimaginable wealth in spices and gold if he would just spare their lives. Da Gama refused all of it.
And I really want to emphasize this point. This atrocity is not a myth. It is meticulously documented by Portugal's own official chronicler, Gaspar Correa, in the Lendas da India. The official records show that Da Gama ordered the ship's hatches to be nailed completely shut so that no one could escape, and then ordered his men to set the vessel ablaze with artillery fire. For 4 agonizing days, the ship burned. Hundreds of innocent men, women, and children were either burned alive or drowned in the sea. These chilling records aren't hearsay. They remain preserved to this day in Portugal's national archives, the Torre do Tombo.
Next up, let's look at the Cartas system, systematized control.
Da Gama quickly realized that sporadic acts of terror weren't going to be enough to sustainably run an empire. So the Portuguese shifted to systemic, bureaucratic control. They effectively strangled centuries of free trade in the Indian Ocean by implementing a rigid monopoly known as the Cartas system. Essentially, this was a massive naval protection racket. Every non-Portuguese vessel, no matter how small, was forced to purchase a pass, or cartaz, from the Portuguese. Plus, locals were entirely banned from trading high-value goods like pepper or firearms. The penalties for defying this? Draconian. If caught without a pass, your vessel was seized or burned, and your crew was immediately executed or sold into slavery.
To ensure this extortionate system held firm, Da Gama pioneered a classic divide-and-rule strategy on the subcontinent. He knew a unified Malabar coast would eventually overwhelm his forces, so he deliberately armed smaller neighboring kingdoms like Cochin. He offered them advanced European weapons and lucrative deals, intentionally turning them against the powerful Zamorin of Calicut. By doing this, he completely fractured the local political landscape and sparked endless regional wars. More significantly, he laid down the exact geopolitical blueprint that later European powers, particularly the British Empire, would adopt to systematically conquer and colonize the rest of India.
Fast forward a couple of decades to 1524, the final voyage and death.
By 1524, the Portuguese Empire in India was incredibly wealthy, but it was also drowning in massive internal corruption and administrative chaos. The Portuguese king realized he needed a harsh, uncompromising hand to clean up the mess. So, he sent a 64-year-old Vasco da Gama back to India as viceroy. Da Gama arrived and immediately started a ruthless purge of corrupt officials. But in this profound twist of historical irony, the man who had survived monstrous storms, conquered vast seas, and decimated ancient empires was ultimately brought down by a single mosquito. Just months into his 3rd voyage, Da Gama contracted severe malaria and died on Christmas Eve 1524 in the city of Cochin.
His physical resting places are actually a perfect metaphor for his deeply divided historical legacy. Initially, his body was buried at St. Francis Church in Kerala, but 14 years later, his remains were dug up and transported all the way back to Lisbon. There he was laid to rest with full royal honors in a grand, soaring monument fitting for a national hero. So today, his tomb in India sits completely empty, a really stark reminder of a violent intrusion, while in Europe, his resting place is treated as an exalted shrine. It's a powerful physical testament to the two completely different narratives surrounding his life.
Let's wrap things up by re-evaluating the colonial legacy.
After looking at the timelines, the economics, the sheer violence, and the primary sources, we're left with a really vital question. How should we remember a figure who irrevocably connected the globe, but did so through documented massacres, mutilations, and systemic extortion? The answer is that history is about critical understanding, not sanitized memorization. True history demands that we look past that single celebratory European perspective of the heroic explorer. We absolutely must acknowledge the brutal, documented reality faced by the people of the Malabar coast. Understanding figures like da Gama means holding both the maritime achievement and the horrific human atrocities in the exact same light, and refusing to let the myth obscure the facts.
Which leaves us with a final, lingering thought to consider today. Given everything we've uncovered from the official archives, we have to ask some profound questions about the legacy we choose to uphold in the modern era. Why do monuments, a major railway station, and an entire city in modern Goa, India, still honor the name of Vasco da Gama? Why preserve the name of the very man who brought this dark tide of fire and exploitation to those exact shores? It's a real question of memory, identity, and the history we collectively choose to celebrate. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer. Keep questioning the narrative, and I'll catch you next time.